Laser Squad, let's get tactical. It's our Sinclair, episode 87. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Sinclair. I'm John.
And I'm Aaron.
Today, Aaron, we're going to be talking about Laser Squad.
No.
Now, Aaron, in lieu of our usual ridiculous banter, I thought we would forego that on this particular occasion because at the end of the show today, we are going to be remembering a major loss in the Spectrum community this week. Oliver Frey has passed away, and several members of our Discord community have wrote some moving eulogies to him. And so we are going to take the back end of this show and devote it to his legacy. So, Aaron, what do you say we jump right in to Laser Squad?
I think that's a good idea. Let's kick it off here, Boat. Bam, Laser Squad. That's first of all an awesome beat right there. Before we get into the game proper, this is our second go around with Laser Squad on a different computer this time around because we looked at this on the Amiga. Of course, this is your home base for Laser Squad. So I was actually kind of interested to see how this would play, and we'll get into that. But the game, of course, is Laser Squad, released on the ZX in 1988. Published by Target Games Limited. They produced, amongst the games they produced were Lords of Chaos, the Rebel Stars. This was famously created by Julien Gollop. He, of course, produced my favorite all-time game on the Specky, which was Chaos, and my son, and we still play that to this day. We love that game. Oh my God, it's so good. He also was responsible for Lords of Chaos, which was like the sequel, a game called Battle Cars, Nebula, and the Rebel Stars series. Also, just a little tidbit here, when they were, of course, this got ported to a bunch of different systems, and Julian's brother did the C64 version. I found that on an interview. So that's kind of neat. We're going to look at that a little bit later. This was worked on by several folks, aside from Julian. You had Mike Stockwell. He also worked on a game called Dustman and Wild West Heroes. A fellow named Mark Potent, who worked on Clax, because it's the 90s, Boat. You know what that means.
It's the time for Clax.
And Tubin. So there's I love both those. Well, I don't love Clax, but I love Tubin. And then lastly, Ian Terry, who worked on the Rebel Star 2 game. This, of course, was a game that was very popular, and so it got a lot of ports, including, of course, the Amiga version, which we played a while back. The Amstrad got a port, Atari ST, the BBC Micro, C64, and the Commodore Plus 4 got a port, but it was an unofficial port, and the MSX also, and let's not forget a DOS port in there. And by the way, when I asked about the DOS port, Julian was not overly impressed with that particular port. I think Crystalis did that one. It didn't get over, and I've heard a lot of things about the old DOS port that weren't real positive.
Well, Crystalis hasn't exactly always done stellar work either.
I knew you were going to bury him. I knew since I said their name, he's going to bury him. The game will run on the 48K, and the Spectrum version was lucky enough to get the expansion, Laser Squad expansion kit, because you'll recall they announced it for the Amiga version, but it was never released. So that's something that we can hang our hats on here. Laser Squad is the natural progression, and we talked about this a little bit in our previous look. This is sort of the natural progression of the formula that Julian sort of cooked up in Chaos. Where you had this mass one-on-one combat that involved basically sending in your flunkies to do some battling. Laser Squad has you in control of squads of men that you assign different equipment to, and you also pick the guys you want, and then you literally deploy them down into a battlefield, and you match wits against your opponent. This is a 1 to 2 player joint boat, and so this gives you the ability to play against the computer or play against your buddy. I will say, I think I would probably like to try this in 2-player mode, and so me and the boy made this one maybe on our list to try out the next time around. I looked at some ads for this just to give people some basis for what you're up to here. And according to one of their big ads, the game features include 8-directional scrolling, that was a big deal at the time, 1 or 2 players, individual combat arenas. You also they build the 8-directional facing of units. That's a funny thing to build. Range combat, strategic scanning, joystick or keyboard. You can carry objects. It also touted that there would be expansions to follow. The game came with 3 scenarios, and they were right. They did actually end up sending out some additional expansions. So, with all that said, Bode, having played this a few times now, how did this shape up when you booted it up and looked at what was on offer on the main screen there?
Well, I want to talk a little bit before I get into my personal thoughts on this game about sort of what this type of game represented to Spectrum users when it was released. The great promise of home computing. There were many great promises of home computing. Your kids would become geniuses. You'd be able to order your dinner and watch the news and do whatever you wanted to your computer.
You order your dinner.
But from a gaming perspective, there were all kind. You can be a spaceman, you can be a soldier. But the big thing, at least in my mind, growing up as a gamer, was that I'd always have somebody to play with, because by the time that I was a youngster, the games had AI. I know the very earliest, games that were sort of top-down experiences like this, you had to have that second player, like Checkers for the Atari 2600 or something like that. But this was a chance. The promise of these type of games were for people that were into pen and paper, Avalon Hill type, tactical war games, to have a digital version where they'd always be able to have an opponent. And you can't undersell that as a feature, because that was something that was truly mind-blowing at the time, that AI had progressed to the point where you could have a tactical war game simulation with a computer-controlled opponent that wasn't just totally dominating or wasn't a pushover. I mean, I think that's a pretty big deal. Don't you agree?
Yeah, listen, I'm glad as usual, Bo, you're thinking outside the box and you're dead on. Being an old guy myself, I can tell you, I'm an old role player from way back. I got into D&D stuff pretty early on. But there was a natural progression to Dungeons and Dragons that came from wargaming, troop games, big battles, and moving squads around a map with miniature wargaming. And which that, of course, birthed your fantasy role-playing, among other things, but that was always a big deal. You mentioned Avalon Hill, and that's absolutely straight-up money. They were a big player in that area. And this game is sort of, you're dead on when you say this is sort of what scratches that itch. This is clearly a popular game, and one of the reasons it's so popular is it laid down on your simple ZX and other computers the ability to simulate a miniature war game style scenario, multiple scenarios, and do it with some grace and charm. There's a text-based air bombing game that we looked at. I remember I talked to Flack about it. That was sort of a tactical attempt from a computer program, and that's the kind of stuff you would have expected back in the day. But here you have something in vivid color that lets you command troops, move them around a map, and even fight your buddy or the computer. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. That was a big selling point for a game like this. This is one of those things that gets lost if you don't think about the era that it took place in. Because that's really key. So very well seen, Bode. I think that's real good. Now, with all that said, this comes up. It's pretty straightforward menu-wise, and it gets you into the action. What did you think of the setup in this? And having played the Amiga version, what did you think of the options and the controls versus what we played in the past?
Well, obviously, when you look at this interface, the first thing that comes to mind is this is going to be a mouse-controlled game. Of course, we're talking about the ZX Spectrum here, so mouse-controlled games were not really on the menu, but this looks as if it were designed to be a mouse-controlled game. You've got a cursor that you're moving around on the screen. They accomplish all that with the use of the joystick. I guess you could use the keyboard too, but I used the joystick when I played. I've got to say, I didn't have real high hopes, and I guess I should have because, well, I don't know. I should and I shouldn't. I will say that I agree with you. Chaos is a great game, but I think that the joystick interface in Chaos leaves a little bit to be desired in terms of its usability.
Yeah, the way he sets selecting stuff, whatever, it's not the easiest or most intelligent way to do it. There's no doubt.
Right. Now, this game, on the other hand, I found it to be extremely intuitive to control with the joystick. I was able to do pretty much whatever I wanted to do right off the bat. I didn't have any trouble at all. Moving around the map, the cursor doesn't move too slow or too quick. I really thought that the interface in this was easy to understand. There were a couple things like I wish that you would auto equip weapons. Sometimes it was kind of a drag to have to go in there and equip your weapon with each guy. But overall, solid A on the interface for this game.
It's funny because I went back and checked out our old Amigos episode on this, and because I wanted to see how after I'd played it, what if I could see any major things that I liked better or worse. And it's funny. I mentioned on the Amigos that I used the keyboard to control it. And you chastised me. You said you should use the joystick. You screwed that up. I used the keyboard again on this. And of course, this is one game. If you're foreign to using ZX emulator on the MiST or whatever, their button setup was different than you would expect. So you're using the I think it's the AQ and the OP, I think, to move the cursor around. So you have to kind of get used to doing that. But I thought once you understood what you were doing, the keyboard did a good job. But some of the same issues that I had when we played this initially, I still had, because it's the same game basically. And the Amiga was it's a very similar. I'd say it was a very lazy port over from the Spectrum version. It's just you have to go through and equip the guys and do all that stuff. And when you don't know what you're doing early on, you could screw up. You could not equip. You could accidentally not equip guys. You could actually give guys the wrong stuff. And then once you deploy them, you've realized that you've screwed up, and it gets old, And there are some ease of use stuff, like you mentioned, that would have been welcome. Now, you putting the game in the time the game was made into context, some of that stuff wasn't really. This is such a new concept that a lot of that stuff hadn't really been created yet, or would be perfected in some of the later games. But overall, I was surprised how well I got around the menus and stuff once I understood how everything worked. It was a lot like Chaos. Chaos is real confusing, but once you've done it a bunch of times, you'll get through it. You'll still blunder up occasionally, but you can get through it. So this game is pretty straightforward. These scenarios, it gives you the 3 basic scenarios to start off with. And then once you pick your weapons and and your troops, and then you basically deploy your guys. And you deploy your guys down in areas that are predetermined. They're marked, so you know where to put them. And then once you've deployed all your characters, it's basically you against the computer. You're moving your guys through. You have action points. These are everything that you do are action points. Even if you just turn in place, you're using action points.
Yeah, and again, this is a holdover from the old Avalon Hill games, where it was the exact same system. Just instead of moving chits around and having to keep track of things on paper, the computer did all the hard work for you.
Have you ever played any of those games? Because you're a board game guy a little bit. Have you ever played any of those really intense? I've
never played any of the actual Avalon Hill games, but I have played war games like that are just kind of newer. I would, you at some point in the past, you bought for me some Avalon Hill games. I have no idea what I did with them. I might have given them back to you. But
I hope you didn't throw them away, Boat.
I didn't throw them away. I might have thrown.
This game, I've played a lot of Mech Warrior, and there are certain aspects of this game that remind me of moving around in Mech Warrior, because in Mech Warrior you have to turn your mech, and you've got a limited amount of travel points you can spend, and so that's something you get used to. When you're playing a game like this, and listen, we both know turn-based war simulators are not necessarily my bag, so I'm not going to tell anybody that I'm good at these games or even competent at them. But you have to, if you're really good at these, you will use your action points in a very in a very efficient way. All right, because you could waste them. And when you get to a point where you need to do something and you look and you don't have enough action points, or the thing says you're out of action points, it's not a happy feeling, especially if you parked your guy with his back to the enemy or something like that, or you're going to get stomped. So efficient use of action points in the game is key. How did you fare at this, Boat, when you were going through these scenarios? I should mention before you get into it, the 3 initial scenarios you get are.
Well, let me talk a little bit about that.
Okay,
go
ahead.
That's where I was going to go. So another thing that makes this game a stone cold classic is the fact that it's not just a deathmatch sort of ordeal. There are 3 scenarios. Yeah. Each one of the scenarios is completely different, and depending on which side you play as, you have different objectives. That is amazing. That is the best, because this type of game can become kind of a slog if all you're doing is moving around a map trying to kill the other team. Okay, so the first scenario is called the Assassins. And what you have to do, if you and there's 2, you're either playing the Assassin Squad, which you're playing by default if you are playing a 1-player game. If you're playing a 2-player game, the second player plays as the Droid Squad. The Assassin Squad, you have to go in and you have to assassinate one of these VIPs, okay? The Droid Squad, your job is to protect the VIP and eliminate all the assassins. You only win if you eliminate all the assassin and the VIP remains alive. So right off the bat, an interesting scenario. Scenario 2 is called Moonbase Assault. What you have to do here, if you're part of the Laser Squad, which is the default first player, what you have to do is you have to destroy a certain number of laser banks. Data banks. The data banks are worth 5 victory points a piece, and if you get 100 victory points, and there's something else you can destroy called an analyzer. So what you're essentially doing is you're going in and you're going all scorched earth on this base, and you don't really have to kill any of the bad guys. You're just going in there trying to destroy these computer systems. Meanwhile, if you're the Omnicorp, your job is to destroy the guys that are trying to destroy the data system. So you've got to knock out the Laser Squad. And then finally, the third mission is called Rescue from the Mines. And this is a prisoner escape mission where you have to go in and you have to free some prisoners. So once you free a prisoner, you move him to an elevator door and then move into the elevator to escape. All 3 of the prisoners that you have to rescue must escape. And if you're the bad guys, if you kill at least 5 of the rebels, then you win. So I really, really appreciate the fact that this game has the amount of varied scenarios that it has, because you wouldn't expect a game from this time period to really have a lot of thought in what you're actually doing. Or if they did, it would be a lot of narrative fluff with no real impact on the actual game itself, versus in this game, each one of these little 3 stories is compelling enough to make you want to play it.
I did try all 3 of these. Mm-hmm. They do have different feels to them. I've gotten sort of obsessed with playing a multiplayer game of this, because I really do think that's where the fun would be. Because I think the computer is it's a lot better than me. Let's just put it that way. And so I would just get repeatedly pounded. I think if I was matched up against a real human, I might have a better shot, unless it was some like Superstar. Mm-hmm. But I do like a game that mixes it up. And you got to think that's crazy to have 3 different scenarios that they had to build them from the ground up to support 2 players, which is not the easiest thing to do. And then, of course, once you flip through those, you can get into the expansion, which provides a couple more. So we both think we like the concept. We like what he's did here. Now, when you get into the nitty gritty of moving your troops around and also getting into distance combat and stuff, this can get a little tricky for me. In fact, this is where I really had trouble. The computer was far more efficient at picking me off from range and stuff. It's all about line of sight. And I do like, it's funny, going back to what you mentioned about the old war games, you can almost hear someone rolling a dice or something on some of these attacks. So there's no surefire shots.
It gives you percentages, and a big part of this game, if you want to become serious, is to study all of the charts that appear in the manual, because you see the math, you see the dice rolls, you see the hit percentages. And to become great at this game, you have to weigh your odds, and so it's a numbers heavy experience, just like a pen and paper war game.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say that this is a game where the documentation, this isn't just the inside of a tape cover.
No,
I mean this thing's got some documentation. It goes into a lot of stuff. And listen, I'm not gonna claim to be King Dong at this game. I'm sure I've only scratched the surface of what this game can be like when you're really good at it. But overall, I think both in a controversial move, I think I actually enjoyed playing this more on the Spectrum than I did on the Amiga.
Oh, no doubt.
Oh, you too? Oh, thank God.
Because, and I'll tell you why. It's because you appreciate even more what the humble Spectrum could do. Because the Amiga can crunch some numbers. It's got the math coprocessor. So, having the Spectrum being able to do what it does, and the speed at which the computer is able to take its turns and react and all those things, not to mention the speed of your own turns as you're moving and firing and things like that. I love playing this game on the Spectrum. Plus, this is, as you know, I'm a kickback, lean back gamer. If I have a chance to play something with a controller, I will, because I like sitting in the old recliner. Being able to drive this whole thing with the joystick made it fantastic for that.
It is strange that we took different control approaches, but I mean, I think this one, I don't really have any problem using the keyboard on this one. I didn't have any problem, and I did try the joystick this time. I didn't try it last time on the Amiga. It was okay, but I've gotten so used, because I always play Chaos with the keyboard too. Mm-hmm. That could be part of it. If you are so inclined, if you really enjoyed Chaos, and I will say now, having not played this in multiplayer, Chaos supports so many simultaneous players that it may be the ultimate multiplayer game. With that said, I have a feeling that the depth that this would provide would be really fun to hook up with two different people.
You know what I wish? I wish that this game had, because I'm the sort of person that has a hard time keeping track of so many different teammates and what they're doing.
Yes.
I wish that there was a way for them to kind of ramp you up to that, and maybe even sort of make the levels of difficulty even more granular, where you start out and you're playing one of these scenarios and you only have control over one guy, and the rest of your guys are computer controlled, and you just worry about what your one guy is doing, and then you graduate to 3 guys, and then you could do the whole team. I know that some people are ready to jump in and control the whole team from Jump Street, which is fine. But I really felt like it was so difficult for me to think about both the individual movement and then the movement as a team. It was a little bit overwhelming at first.
I would get, of course, you can scan and get like the big map that comes up. I kind of wish that I wish the rooms, because again, there's a lot of sameness here, and it was confusing to keep track of your guys. And now, of course, just like in Chaos, as you switch between guys, it tells you how many action points you've got. So you can sort of tell who you've moved, but it still would be nice to really differentiate them. Of course, it's a difficult ask, given what you've got to work with here and given the way it looks. But that would have been nice, or even I would have liked if the game had sectioned off some of the different areas in it with like different shade coloring, or even like a name or something. I don't mean we don't have to have like named rooms everywhere, but just to keep track of where you're at and where you're going. That was a little overwhelming, but I don't chalk it up to the game. I just thought my shortcoming.
This might come from the era where having a piece of grid paper whenever you turned on your Spectrum right next to you was almost a given, because in almost every Spectrum game that we play, there is an element of mapping involved. And that could have been part of the quote-unquote fun of the game, is mapping out these levels on the grid paper as well as seeing them on the screen.
It's funny how quickly that became not fun. And I can tell you, I can pinpoint when it happened. It was the exact time that I'd played enough Rogue. I'm like, all right, I'm done with this. Get it out. I took a look at another version of this. I thought we'd talk about it, and since it was programmed by Julian's brother, it makes it more interesting. But that was the Commodore 64 version, which guess what? They look fairly similar, and much like I think almost all these look pretty similar. There's a little more. Would you say there's more graphical flourish? What do you think when you look at these?
I think the C64 version looks like butt.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
You hate the C64, but
look at me. I'll say it till they die. It looks like a layer of purplish green slime is smeared all over the screen of the C64. Everything has this sort of washed out, slightly sickly look to it, and it can't compare to the bright sharpness of the display of the ZX Spectrum.
I will say the Spectrum uses its palette in a very pleasing way on this game, but I don't think the C64 version looks okay. C64 version reminds me a little bit more of almost like the graphics in like an Ultima or something. That's got that kind of look to it.
Yeah.
But I think now I will say I didn't get a chance to try the C64. Did you have a go at it?
No, but I would wager that the AI subroutines and everything like that, if this was ported by Julian's brother, he probably had access to all that stuff.
Yeah. I would say you're right. I looked at some reviews on this boat before we get to our listener reviews. This game was highly praised, boat. The average magazine score rating for this was 89%, and this won several awards, including the CNVG reward for a hit and the Your Sinclair Amiga Game Award. And looking over the magazines, Your Sinclair gives us a 9 out of 10. The Games Machine 84%. Sinclair User 89. Crash gave this an 89, and Computers and Video Games gave this a 97. They were really up in it. So this was a well-received game. But how did it play with our listeners, Boat?
Oh, we had there was some action on the old.
Did we get some action?
We got some action on the old our Sinclair channel on our Discord server. We're going to start things off with Jed Byrne. He says, there was no other game quite like it back in the 80s, and it still plays well today once you figure it out. The game allows complex tactics, especially with opportunity fire. After the basics are mastered, there's still much to find. Grenades and plant pots, setting up chain reactions, and searching an enemy body to find their security pass and access the computer system are just a few of the discoveries waiting to reward those that persevere. Then playing against another human takes it to a whole new level. It's hard to believe that this was just an early step in a game style that Julian Gollop is still developing. I have Phoenix Point, but I enjoy playing this more. Steve Smith writes, one of my fondest memories of playing on my Speccy was an 8-hour Laser Squad session with a friend. I never played any other game for such a long period, which shows how good it is and how much replay value it has. No two games are ever the same, and the breadth of tactics you can use is infinite. Obviously, like most games of this type, playing against a human opponent is really where it's at, and in my opinion, this was the best turn-based strategy game on the Spectrum, and its only competition was other Gollop games. It looks really good and plays even better. 10 out of 10.
Wow.
And Mitsuyama writes, my memory is very hazy about this, but I think this was the first turn-based strategy game I played. Not the first played, it was certainly the first one that caught my interest, and I ended up playing it a lot. I remember finding it rather impenetrable at first, but once I got into it, it became a favorite, at least until the next best thing came along. I like being able to take a slow, methodical approach to completing the missions, making sure I kept the units together, covering each other. It wasn't long after I got this game that I moved on to the Amiga, and I remember feeling disappointed with the Amiga version, probably because I expected more than a reskinned 8-bit game. Get ready for lots of disappointments, Mitsuyama. Playing it again today, I don't think it's aged very well, but a lot of this is related to the fact that it's restricted to joystick or keyboard controls. Although Gollop did a good job with these restrictions, it's still more natural to play with these types of games with a mouse. However, this remains a Spectrum classic, 9 out of 10. So the Discord community, they like it.
Yeah, like I said, is this my type of game? Not necessarily, but it's got enough in common with the game I absolutely love. Because really, in all honesty, Chaos isn't my type of game either. It just grew on me. And this one, it's funny when we picked this. When this came up, when the selection committee picked it, I was like, oh man. But as I got back into it, I actually enjoyed it, not just because I was on the Spectrum, just because I knew a little bit more about it than the first time. I enjoyed it a lot more than I did when we played it on the Amigos. And of course, I do think the Spectrum really is the system to run a game like this. I mean, this looks like a Spectrum game. It plays like a Spectrum game. It really is a Spectrum game, and I think that's what limited its appeal on the Amiga, because it was a Spectrum game on the Amiga. If you're going to play a Spectrum game, just play it on the Spectrum boat.
Right. And so that is really all that needs to be said about Laser Squad. All right, Aaron, we're going to end today's show with sharing some reminiscences from our Discord community about Oliver Frey and what he's meant to the Spectrum community over the years. Of course, he's a Swiss-born, mostly UK resident. I think he moved back to the UK in the 70s, started working in the magazine industry, and quickly found an audience with his incredibly evocative covers for both Crash Magazine and Zap 64. If you're watching the YouTube version of this video, we want to give a special shout out and thank you to Paul, aka Hermsky, for allowing us to use some of these images that he's put together as we read these reminiscences. Paul is he's the chairman of the Our Sinclair Game Selection Committee, and he also has a very great YouTube channel called Back to 8-Bit with Hermsky. So I'm just going to dive right into these, Aaron. We'll start with Paul. Paul says, the sad news of Oliver's passing has totally rocked the community here in the UK. His artwork was and still is just on another level, taking you completely into another world. The perfect escapism with so many stories to be told with the art. I'm fortunate enough to have acquired a fair few personally signed limited edition prints from Roger and Oliver, along with a signed copy of his book, The Fantasy Art of Oliver Frey. One of my favorite books in my retro collection, a book for anyone to go back to after a bad day in the office to lift your spirits. For decades, anyone who ever asked me who my favorite artist was, Ollie was always my answer. Crash Magazine was probably, for me, the first home computer magazine to be able to fully communicate and engage with its younger audience, something other magazines just couldn't do. Same with Oliver's artwork, pushing boundaries in our imagination to the next level and beyond. Even in today's world, walking into a modern newsagent, you will never see a magazine cover like Oliver's. Although back then, some covers did cause a bit of controversy with retailers. But the risks paid off, and some of the best fantasy art was born. A true legend, one that helped shape my life growing up. Benz writes, an entire generation of 80s gamers will forever think about Oliver's work when they cast their minds back to those heady days. His Crash covers are as much a part of those days as the games themselves were. I used to stare at them and build stories in my mind about what was happening in the artwork, what came before, and what happened next. Perhaps the artwork was more impactful then because we were all used to having to use our imaginations when we played games. That collection of color-clashing dots was a ship, or an alien, or a character. Oliver's work fed directly into that. It felt like the worlds of our imaginations coming to life. He was the perfect artist for the time, and his passing makes those days feel that little bit further away now. Will Brooker writes, I think the importance of Ollie's work can't be underestimated. Without those covers, Crash wouldn't have had the same impact, and the magazine culture would have never developed the way that it did. Without that magazine culture, there wouldn't have been the same sense of irreverent, celebratory community around the Spectrum. If we'd only had Sinclair user as it was back in 1982, the Spectrum could have retained that middle-aged hobbyist vibe for a few years, then faded away, and we wouldn't have had Zap, Amtix, and the magazines that copied Crash's approach. But even more importantly, I think Ollie showed us how to imagine the worlds the games were representing. Before him, I think games artwork was much more basic and unambitious. Ollie encouraged the idea that those simple graphics were just simple symbols of a rich fantasy universe, that the actual game was vivid and realistic, and that the graphics just hint at what they're really showing. These days, games really do look like movies, but he showed us that Spectrum graphics were meant to represent movie worlds. Apart from anything else, you can only imagine the challenges faced by a gay couple in the 1980s, a period of rampant homophobia, trying to set up a magazine for teenage boys with school kids reviewing and lots of hunky men on the covers. There's a whole history there, and I think it's actually an important story within gay British culture. Naturally, I had no idea at the time about their sexuality and that the two guys behind Crash were a couple, but looking back, they somehow worked wonders within a decade of unashamed anti-gay prejudice. Anyway, I will always remember Ollie's work for the rest of my life. I can guarantee that. It's been part of my imagination for 40 years, and I'm not going to forget him before I pass on myself. Tin Pot Gamer writes, I rarely bought Crash, as it often wasn't available, or I was driven to your Sinclair and Sinclair user based on the cover tape contents. But Ollie's incredible work has still made its way firmly into my brain over the years. As said above, it really does help to fuel the imagination, whether it's mysterious covers with things to see in reflections of eyewear, fantasy worlds brought to life, or the action shots and movement of characters charging towards the viewer. The details really did make it stand out over so many covers on the shelf. A terrible shame that such an incredibly talented artist has gone. Mr. Rocket writes, I remember every month looking forward to the latest Crash or Zap to see what cover Ollie had created. The other mags looked stale and boring in comparison to the visual delights he would conjure up consistently. I doubt many artists could have matched the sheer volume and high standard of artwork he was creating then. He was a bona fide genius in his field. I must admit to having a lump in my throat as I read an issue of the Games Machine recently and came across a picture of young Ollie in his Newsfield branded baseball cap. A great loss and the end of an era. Jigglebox writes, not much more I can add to the comments already made. A very sad loss. Fairly recently, I bought the book of art by Oliver Frey and only then realized his involvement with the Eagle comic back in the 80s. I knew I had an annual somewhere, so I dug it out, and it was great to see his work there too. My canvas of the first Crash cover is a fondly prized possession, as is my thumbs up portrait, even if it is Zap 64 based. Rest in peace. Z9K9 writes, with countless images of scintillating color, detail, action, and beauty, Frey added greatly to the vitality of gaming in the 80s. And finally, Jed Byrne writes, the art of Oliver Frey had a profound impact on me. No other artist was able to capture the internal worlds I visited by playing games. In addition to the covers, he filled the magazines with character and flair, such as the Ollie bugs that scuttled about the pages. None of this was necessary, but he did it anyway and lifted the publications into something magical. They sparked with imagination, igniting the reader's own imagination. So yeah, lots of touching tributes to Oliver. Aaron, were you aware of this guy before we started doing our shows?
No, I'm not. And it's funny. I've only recently, say within the past couple years, looked into him wholesale because it's funny. A lot of it was because I was looking at maybe grabbing some magazines, and I noticed that a lot of these Crash magazines were like getting really expensive, and now they've gotten even more expensive. And as I look through them, it much like comics, when you've got a real ripping good cover. And I think that's a big reason why. It's because the art's so good. And then once I started looking into it, I was like, man, this guy's... listen, I was a teenage boy back in those days, in the 80s. And this guy he's hitting all the right buttons, man. His art is... I mean, first of all, he's super duper talented, obviously. He was more than a good hand. He was a really great artist. But there's more to it than just having talent. You've got to know what to draw and how to do it, and he did. I always think back to that. I mean, I can imagine when someone saying, listen, I know this is a super famous cover, but it's one I always think of is the one where someone was like, listen, we need a cover for this issue that we're looking at golf and this guy draws the hot chick eating the popsicle, and the only fragments of a golf game were just reflected in the glasses.
Right.
I love that cover,
Mm-hmm.
but he's got tons of great work. I know it was a big loss for a lot of the community over there, and a big loss for everyone because we've lost a very talented artist and also an icon of the era. So all you can really say is thanks for all what you did, and happy trails, Oliver.
Absolutely. And with that, we bring this episode of Our Sinclair to a close. We want to thank the members of Clive's Club, the group that picks the games that we play every week. Mr. Rocket, Mitsuyama, Richard Goulstone, Paul Harrington, McChessers, Jed Byrne, Justin Tinbot-Kamer, Orkmeal, and Paul, a.k.a. Hermsky. We'd also like to invite anybody that likes this show and would like to support it to visit our page at patreon.com/OurSinclair. We have a goal. If we can get to $200 a month in support, Our Sinclair will morph from a monthly show to a weekly show, which would be amazing. And that leads us to our Sinclair roll call. These are the rest of our patrons: Pajako6502, Will Brooker, Wanderly Chesum, Stephen Wilcott, Chartel, Nathan Mills, Doug Berry, Jigglebox, David Terrace, Andrew Waite, Eric Nelson, Captain Crispy, Laurent Giroux, Mark Downey, Peter Molland, Chris Folds, Mark Durham, Pixels at Dawn, and O'Brien's Retro and Vintage.
Thanks, y'all. Appreciate it.
If you like this format, you want to hear more, feel free to check out our other shows: Amigos, Everything Amiga, Our Sinclair, which is this show, the CoCo Show, all about the Tandy Color Computer, ARG Presents, and the Atari ST Show. And of course, we can't forget about ARG Presents, where you and the Brent spin the wheel and make the deal. All these shows can be found on the Amigos Retro Gaming YouTube channel at youtube.com/Amigos Retro Gaming, or you can listen to the audio versions at anchor.fm/Amigos Podcast. Aaron, what is on the docket for the next episode of Our Sinclair?
Let's find out, shall we? Oh, man, he's back.
Fast food.
He's back. The egg is back.
That's right. So this is a different kind of Dizzy game. I don't know if this is one of those things like, you know how Mario was in like all of the Nintendo games when the Nintendo first came out, but they never really called him Mario. I wonder if this is a canonical Dizzy game, or if this is just like, this is an egg, representative of an egg-shaped species.
I've heard of this one. I think I may have even tried it, but I don't remember anything about it. So it'll be looking at it with new eyes.
Yeah. So we can't wait to do that. We will see you guys next time. Until then, rewind tape
and press play.